Now changing the gears a bit, let's move forward with a fireside chat on the topic, the world of clinical trials up for some big changes, ? In light of the pandemic, the importance of speeding up clinical trials became clear. Expect the adoption of hybrid and decentralized trial design to dominate in the coming years. By means of this session, the subject matter experts, Garrett Temple, founder and CEO of Novogiene, Carley Applegate, founder, EvelynElaine and Alexander Kunz, CEO of OP2 Labs, will talk about the changing landscape of clinical research and trials. Let's give them a warm welcome to the stage. Come on up, guys.
Well, first of all, I'd just like to say it's great to have this opportunity to talk to you about this subject, clinical trials. A little about myself. The reason I'm interested in talking about clinical trials is my company recently created a device that we are going to start doing clinical trials on. And how about yourselves? What's your relation to that area? What do you do, and how does that have to do with clinical trials?
My organization, EvelynElaine, we are entering into clinical trials. We're waiting on our thumbs up from the NIA. For me and my perspective, looking at the participation and advocacy of the entire family involved in the clinical trials, including the caregivers.
Yeah, so for us, we actually manufacture and distribute nutraceutical products internationally. So,
Interesting.
So clinical trials are a very important part of product claims. So we do a lot of testing on products and clinical trials for different medical use.
Very interesting. Now, one thing that was mentioned regarding clinical trials and the current state of how it works is vaccines. I mean, obviously the COVID vaccine had to go through its own series of clinical trials to make sure it worked. But there's also more experimental, emerging ones. Just a few I can think of off the top of my head. HIV vaccine, the so-called fentanyl vaccine that's being developed. What do you think is going to happen with these experimental vaccines? What do you think the clinical trials for them would look like?
Well, personally, I think, novel therapeutics like mRNA are really going to drive a whole different approach to clinical trials and prioritization of therapeutics for very specific use cases. Some of the things that we can kind of expect is really decentralization of clinical trials, the introduction of technology, which I think will really start with more machine learning. And I know a lot of what we talked about during this conference is AI, but there is a big difference between machine learning and AI.
Right,
not one and the
right.
same. And I think what we're going to see is the improvement on the collection of data sets and the type of data we collect in clinical trials, because that data can then be integrated into machine learning to make predictive decisions and outcomes.
What do you think, Carley?
I think that we're going to see, at least for probably the next couple of years, increased scrutinization when things do come out at an increased speed. I think there was a lot of love lost in the clinical trial process over the last couple of years by just the general public, just with miscommunications through the FDA and the CDC. And so I think we're going to see a lot more scrutiny for the next couple of years. And then after that, I really do see it just kind of booming. I do agree that we're going to see a lot of clinical trials initiated more in the private sector. Just trying to be that next big thing. But I do think that we're gonna see a lot of skeptics for at least a couple more years, just because of what we've all been through, and the Facebook MDs and the talking heads and stuff like that. So
Right.
I think at least the next 2 years is going to be a little rough.
Yeah, and while we're on the subject of experimental technologies, emerging technologies, and how it relates to clinical trials, there are things being worked on right now like cell culture farming and microfluidic systems where you can simulate organs on a microchip. What do you think that will mean for the future of clinical trials? I personally think that if this technology is further developed and further deployed, it could mean big changes. We could possibly see an end to animal testing for clinical trials, and we could see big changes also for the use of human test subjects in clinical trials as well. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great example because there are other things that are being worked on too besides that. I mean, they've already proved the use case for 3D printing human organs, right? So we can actually emulate natural human tissue. So I think that's really going to, and as the saying goes, mice lie. And the practical reality is that a lot of the testing on animals doesn't necessarily translate to human. And so we'll see things like, using actual human organs that are 3D printed, what you're talking about. And also with the advent of technology, things like augmented reality and VR, we can do clinical trials, clinical testing and trials on things like genome testing and genome sequencing, where we can actually be collaborating on a worldwide forum through the use of augmented reality and VR and actually perform that testing in front of a bunch of industry experts.
I'd really like to see that happen soon. That sounds like it will definitely change a lot. What about you, Carly? What do you think?
Well, I'm not an expert in cell technology. Or
Neither am I. I just find it very interesting.
But one of the, for my scope, one of the biggest breakthroughs just happened in October with the FDA formally acknowledging caregivers as part of the clinical trial process. Eventually, whether it's 3D printing organs or AI or computer simulations, these clinical trials will have to hit a human being at some point in time.
Eventually there is going to be the need for a human test subject in clinical trials.
Yeah, and I mean we've talked about the clinicians, we've talked about AI, we've talked about telehealth, but actually acknowledging that there are human beings behind the clinical research subject that can help efficiency, can help with outcomes, even just making sure that somebody shows up to those tests and gets there safely is such a big deal. And so again, for the FDA to actually acknowledge the caregiver as something more than a chauffeur, I think is huge long term too.
Yeah, I think that's actually a very interesting point that you bring up with the changes in policy the FDA has made to allow caregivers to partake in clinical trials. I think it's definitely going to change things a lot in terms of the human element of testing in these clinical trials. But can you elaborate a little more on that? Like how it makes you feel and what you think the implications will be going into the future?
Well, I mean, our non-professional caregivers, those wives and husbands and kids, that's our largest healthcare workforce that we have. They just don't happen to be paid, right? It's 53 million of them. And so even if there's, 1/10 that are participating in a clinical study at any stage, that's going to be, you're going to have fewer people drop out of the clinical trial process. You're going to have greater compliance, which means that the end product is going to be better. It's going to be more accurate. It's going to be more precise. You're going to have better documentation about side effects or any type of adverse reactions. You're just going to have better data because it's no longer going to be just patient dependent. It's not going to be just lab dependent, but there's going to be a perspective.
And what do you think, Alexander? How do you feel about the changes in FDA policy that opens up clinical trials for caregivers to be a part of?
Well, I always look at things from a business process perspective, and the practical reality is when you look at the clinical trials on new drug approvals this past year, we approved 20 new drugs, right? But you compare that to 2021 and 2020, where respectively we had 50 and 53 drug approvals. So, the problem is even with changes in regulations, it's really the speed and velocity at which we can actually approve drugs. And I think some of that's contingent upon the fact that we haven't really leveraged the ability of technology to automate certain things and or define standardized data sets for the type of data we want to collect on a clinical trial.
Right.
And other things that come into effect are much like you were talking about, some of the cell capabilities in cloning organs. Practical reality is if you're not able to achieve certain outcomes in your preclinical trials, then you're probably not going to go to a clinical trial.
Yeah.
So I think
That's
the
true.
reality is that really the speed is going to take a lot of different things: standardizing data, the use of technologies, decentralization, so that we can speed the process up, and also leverage expertise on an international basis, versus trying to find a pool of individuals here just in one country.
Yeah.
Definitely a lot to think about.
Well, and to add to that too, the expansion of what qualifies as a clinical trial too.
Right, right.
I think is going to have. Again, I'm optimistic myself, but there's not just the biology, but now if a clinical trial or if a trial can affect psychosocial, mental health, it's going to fall under that clinical trial spectrum, which, again, I think will help. I definitely think will help reduce the amount of snake oil that hits the products or hits the market sometimes. But I think that in combination with what he was saying will, again, be a huge game changer.
Yeah, I mean, it's everything. I think regulations do one thing, and really what they are. It's just a regulation is really a standard set of guidelines that are really designed to be very generic, right? And the practical reality is we do a lot of clinical testing on our products, but if I want to achieve an outcome to test for one thing, that's very easy to do, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's a conclusive test. And so I think a lot of it is real. Part of the problem is that regulations, need to really start considering communities and groups that help define standardization on how we perform clinical testing and the minimum data sets we need to collect to achieve a particular outcome.
Okay, so given what we've talked about so far with new and emerging technologies and technologies that already exist that are just waiting to be more widely adopted, we've talked about data set standardization, AI and machine learning, cell culture farming, growing organs in petri dishes, or even organs on chips through microfluidic systems. Do you see any of these things really being applied within the next few years? And if so, how quickly do you think it'll be adopted? Where do you think it's going to be used? How do you think it's going to really change things?
I think that some of these things have to, they'll have to prove themselves before they can be a standard of practice. I think for the cell fluidity and even the 3D printing, we know we can do it, but we don't know how necessarily that's going to work long term.
Right, there's still a lot that needs to be figured out.
Yeah, and I think that there's still going to be some efficacy that needs to be built behind some of these practices, and some of them are still theoretical before we see it actually hit the market. So, I mean, I'd venture to guess that we're going to work at the speed of the FDA, and it's going to be several years before we actually see practical applications, outside of, university-based research.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. It's going to take many years to actually develop that technology in a way that it's widely adopted. But even though COVID was one of these things that was very disruptive to our society, the great thing about COVID is that there were many medical facilities that weren't even really leveraging technology, and it really forced the adoption of technology. Mm-hmm. And by forcing the adoption of technology, we have now created an environment where people are willing to look at that technology. In terms of, are we using it now? Absolutely. I mean, I'm a big investor in technology companies, and one of the larger growth sectors right now is healthcare. everything
Right.
from telemedicine to mostly machine learning, and there's some AI research going on out there. There are companies now that have leveraged augmented and virtual reality, and one company in particular, actually, that's what they do genome testing on, right? So they can actually, everybody around the world can get on a VR headset, but augmented reality is they can actually leverage a real-world environment to actually do things like gene splicing or measurement between genomes. So, it's happening, but it's going to definitely take many years before we actually start to see that being used in a clinical setting.
I agree. I mean, the technology is there one form or another. If it's actually mature enough to put to use is a whole nother question, and that's really what we're going to be seeing going into the future, I think. But kind of related to that, do you think some of this experimental technology that could be used in clinical trials will maybe not completely do away with, but at least fix some of the problems of unintended consequences of new drugs, vaccines, therapy procedures? Because you know how every drug, they say there are side effects. Do you think it's possible to, if not remove the problems caused by potential side effects, at least mitigate them through new methods that could be used in clinical trials like the ones we discussed?
Oh, I mean, that would require you taking the human element out of it entirely.
Which is a whole nother problem.
Right. But, everything's on a bell curve.
Right.
Literally everything. And clinical trials are the same. And you want a good 90% right in the middle. But you'll always have those margins. You're always going to have somebody who doesn't react well. You're always going to have somebody with, some variant that reacts to either the medications or the haptens in the medications. I don't think that there's any potential omnipresent view to, be able to look and say, no one's going to have a reaction from this.
No, of course not. That's unrealistic to
I
think there's
think-
not going to be any kind of reactions.
Yeah.
I mean, everybody's different. Everybody's prone to some kind of side effect.
Yeah. I think, really leveraging data sets and being able to see, if there's certain commonalities or causations when they're looking at clinical trials. But again, unless you take the humans out of the medicine entirely, I don't think there's any way to really predict everything.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. Unless you could really 3D print a human that represents like every genetic trait or marker out there, you're not going to be able to test for everything. But however, I mean, I think things like machine learning. So what is machine learning? It's technology and algorithms that identify patterns to make decisions. And then what it does is it learns through data and experience to improve itself.
Right.
And so as that relates to clinical trials, the better data sets we have, the more informed that machine learning is, that it can actually predict outcomes to some extent. And so I think we do have to improve the type and quality of data that we are collecting to leverage that technology to inform us of potential complications with clinical trials and testing.
So assuming we are able to collect the right data and a large enough amount, what you're saying is we'd be able to make more accurate, better informed predictions about who may experience some adverse reaction to a drug or vaccine or whatever they may be given as part of a clinical trial. Is that correct?
Yeah, of course, because as a human, I mean, we're not thinking about all the other things that are out there, genetic traits, genetic markers, what part of the country you came from, what type of food you eat, what other types of drugs you're taking at the time during a clinical trial. But that's where I think things like technology can improve the process through which we are testing things in a clinical trial, because it can take in large amounts of data and make predictive outcomes based on that data.
Right.
I also think that it can help in the precursor to the clinical trial as far as finding more appropriate and qualified candidates for whatever clinical trial, right? You can add in all of those data points from age, disease, genome, altitude, region, everything like that, and be able to be more precise when clinicians or researchers are looking for clinical subjects. I think that's going to be probably more applicable on the front end, at least until technology catches up with all of the data in the back end.
Yeah, and on that point, everything you brought up about data points that could be collected, geographic origin, age, ethnicity, nationality, pre-existing genetic conditions, you really start to get into the area of personalized medicine in addition to just the clinical trials and being able to predict outcomes and adverse reactions that could happen. Do you really see a sort of convergence point between the emerging areas of personalized medicine and where clinical trials could be headed based on what we've been talking about?
I mean, in theory, yes. In practical application, no. Just because that would require 100% compliance, right? And there's always somebody who could exercise a little bit more, drink a little bit more water, eat a little bit more
Right, we're not all
healthy.
entirely the same.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at most of our disease processes that we have, at least here in the U.S., some of those take a lot of hard work and dedication to get and maintain. I mean, it's some of it is a lifestyle choice, and so yeah, in theory it would be nice, but again, there's still free will, there's still bad choices, there's still a myriad of things.
Right, people are still free agents, free actors who do what they want ultimately in the end.
Yeah, and I mean, somebody's health can't supersede their free will.
No.
So.
Yeah, and I don't think it's really at some point. Do you have to improve the quality of those participating in a clinical trial? Not necessarily, and that's really a technology problem in my mind. I mean, what we're starting to see things now are a pill that you can swallow that can do internal diagnostics on a patient, right? We have devices now that you can hook up to your finger that can do genome testing or blood sequencing, right? So to me, it's a technology issue. Have we gotten to the point where we can uniquely identify characteristic traits of an individual who's involved in that testing? No, because really most clinical trials it's all about structured data sets, right? I'm defining whatever my outcome is, but at the same time, a certain amount of data I'm collecting. But the great thing about technology is I don't have to work with a structured data set. I could work with unstructured data sets.
Right.
I can incorporate IoT, LOT devices that are collecting biological metrics real time to give me all the data I need, so that if I have a interaction from somebody on a clinical trial, it may be able to identify unique traits that are attributed to that individual.
Definitely. And really going on with that, since genetics does not equal personality, everybody's different. If we were to collect data on potential patients or people to be potentially involved in a clinical trial, what do you think that data collection would look like, and who would be the right sort of candidates to be part of that data set?
I mean, we already collect that data. Every billing claim goes with that data. I think, again, it would just, with assistive technologies, it would actually help, add some precision on locating the patients for clinical trials. Clinical trials are hard to access. If you don't know what you're looking for, you don't know what you don't know. And so it may actually
be unknown unknowns, yes.
Well, I mean, again, we're talking about people who aren't in this space. We're talking about families. We're talking about kids. We're talking about welders and teachers. So I think that, again, having specific data points that could help researchers find that patient or those individuals, I think that will, again, help with the efficacy long run.
So it can solve the problem of sort of the known unknowns with the data and figuring out how that relates to the efficacy of trials and what can be done?
Not quite. It's more like it's again, finding that right subject for that trial, and making sure that subject meets what the researchers are needing. And again, we already produce
okay.
that data with every billing claim, because every claim goes out with CPTs and ICD-10s and, you know, everything. So, you know, using technology to access that data to pinpoint subjects, I think is going to be the most useful.
Okay, I got it.
Yeah, I mean, it's to your point about is the data collected, absolutely, but I think to some extent too that data is very decentralized, so in a lot of cases it's not accessible, and the question of whether or not we're collecting all the data necessary to make decisions on predetermined outcomes, I don't think so, right? Because, you know, if you administer somebody a drug, you're looking for an adverse reaction, not any reaction. So if you could do things like incorporate biometric devices where now there's a fluctuation in blood pressure or an increase in body temperature that could be an indication of some type of reaction, that's stuff we don't collect in clinical trials, right? Because it's not, you know, it's typically some adverse reaction, somebody reports something, hey, I'm having this, but it's a noticeable thing that we see. But I think, you know, the use of technology can greatly improve our ability to be able to identify reactions in certain types of individuals and be able to isolate, you know, whether that there are certain genetic traits or markers or family history problems that led to that interaction.
I actually think we'll see a lot more remote patient monitoring in that space.
Absolutely.
To be able to
I agree.
To be able to capture fluctuations, changes in condition.
Yep.
Again, being able to just identify things real time, I think will make a huge difference long term too.
Oh, absolutely. If you're able to monitor things in real time and record what happens as it happens, that's definitely going to change everything in terms of how the clinical trials are going to happen and what the aftermath is going to be, what it's going to look like once the trials conclude.
I think will help in the speed too. Just
definitely,
you know,
definitely.
You
I
can
agree.
take months and months of research and really condense it down if you're using real time, because you're
Right.
getting all of that all the time. So I do think it will help with the, God, I don't want to use speed, but the,
You can get what's effectively the highlights.
yeah, maybe a more effective clinical trial, you know, because I always remind my patients, my clients, you know, we don't want speed, we want accuracy.
Right.
And certainly that's the case with clinical trials, where you want the best accuracy, you want the best outcomes, not necessarily speed. And I think that's sometimes in contention with the commercialization, because, you know, people want to get that out as fast as possible, and I understand that, but you don't want to do it too fast.
Right, there's always a rush to bring something to market, but there's also problems if you rush too much. You go too fast, there's going to be issues. There's going to be things you didn't catch during the initial clinical trials that now once your drug or vaccine is on the market and people are taking it, people are using it, they start having adverse reactions, and why didn't we see this before? Because it was rushed, right?
Well, and sometimes it's not even the adverse reactions. You don't get the opportunity to educate the community, prepare the community. And again, I think we saw this during COVID. And, you know, however you feel about the vaccine and the clinical trials, from start to finish, the vaccine was a modern miracle. I mean,
Oh, absolutely.
The time it took, how quickly it was done, just the joint efforts and how many organizations came together to do it. It's a modern miracle, but there was not enough time to prepare the public. There was not enough time to prepare the practitioners to answer questions. There wasn't enough time to, let that sink in. And again, that's what happens. It's one of the disadvantages of doing something too quickly.
Right.
Because you can't educate the practitioners, you can't educate the clinicians, you can't, have thinking sessions like this so you can be like, oh, what if they ask this question? What if they ask that? How are we going to answer it? And that's important. When people are asking for informed consent and their practitioner can't quite answer the question. And again, that's one of the downsides of doing something too quickly, because you just don't have time to prepare the people who are going to actually implement it.
Definitely.
Yeah. You want to go to Q&A?
Yeah, we've got some time.
Yeah, why don't we go to Q&A now?
Any questions, in the
Yeah, we got-
audience?
Let's hear what the audience has to say.
Hi, thank you first. I really appreciate this. On the idea of potential wearable technology for collecting data, how far away do you think we are from having that? I mean, when you look at the research right now on wearable technology, there's pretty huge discrepancies between a smartwatch and the, whatever else, rings or whatnot. How long do you think it'll be before they're accurate enough that we can use that for individuals?
We already have the technology out there, but I think the struggle with the market is trying to find the particular use case. And I think that's where they're really struggling because, a lot of these companies that are developing and very innovative out there, they're looking for funding. They're a company and they have to survive. And so they're trying to identify a particular market use case, which may not be the use case that everybody else is looking for. All these technologies exist, everything from micro robotics to nanotechnology to things that can do very advanced diagnostics on a human being, even do gene coding. I mean, it's pretty advanced, but the struggle is there's like a very decentralized approach. Everybody's trying to do one thing and nobody's looking at the, healthcare industry as a whole.
Also, there's been in geriatrics we've had fall alarms for 20 years now, wearable fall alarms, but it's that centralization and where does that information go, and so it's also again goes back to practicality. Does everybody need to wear a biometric device? Everybody's got a Fitbit, everybody's got a smartwatch, but do patients need that? And if they do, when? What's the setting? What's the appropriateness? There has to be kind of some parameters. Otherwise, you just have data going nowhere.
Yeah. I mean, I think the struggle that you're seeing, and it was identified in earlier sessions, is that the problem is you have an organization that's developing emerging technology to solve a particular problem. They want to own the data. They don't want to sell it. So it's the Google, Facebook model. So, the problem is there's a lot of other companies developing technology, but nobody wants to share the data. They want to keep the data. And so I feel like, instead of working as a consortium or a group that's advising on one another how to improve healthcare as a whole, what we really have right now are a lot of different silos trying to solve different problems and trying to figure out how to make money off the data I'm collecting. So,
shifting gears a little bit, one of the dilemmas is minority participation. Tuskegee Airmen, the trials with Latinos in Nicaragua and abuse have created an understandable reluctance in minority participation. Yet, as we look to the future and some of the data you've talked about, we've got to overcome that bridge. I'd wondered what wisdom you all might have about that. And then the second question is one that I used to face all the time in my career in managed care, which is the question of managing to label versus managing to clinical evidence. Do you think any of the emerging technologies can help us there?
I guess I'll take the first question here. In terms of, absolutely, the diversity of those participating in clinical trials are absolutely important because that's where you're really identifying the effect of a drug on a particular population, whether that's a genetic marker, a trait, a region they live in. I don't know how to solve that problem, but I do think the decentralizing of clinical trials will help, and to some extent, making those things through the use of technology more accessible could facilitate more participation. But to be more specific here, I'm not really sure how we could solve the problem overnight.
I think that, once trust is lost, it's hard to really earn back. And I think seeing a more diversified healthcare workforce, research workforce, I think that will help. But it's one of those things that pharmaceuticals, research groups, universities, all of us just have to earn some trust back. And that's going to take time, and that's going to take genuine action and sincerity. You know, that's about as much wisdom as I can give you. Is we just got to earn it back.
The only thing I can really say is, given the ability to collect data and work with data, yes, we can probably simulate what a clinical trial might look like on minority populations given data that's already been collected, but simulation's really no substitution for the actual thing, and I think that really will remain a problem as long as that trust isn't there, to echo what Carley said.
Yeah, and it's a great question you're asking, and I think part of the problem is maybe we just need to ask the question, why are these people not participating? Is it a distrust in pharmaceuticals? I don't know. I don't know the answer, right? But I think it's about data, right? And the first thing we should probably do is ask those people themselves why they're unwilling to participate in clinical trials. And your second question, sorry?
Second question was the question whether you have any particular wisdom on the idea of managing to label versus managing the clinical evidence. You know, as an example, a lot of the diabetes drugs which deal with type 2 diabetes are not indicated below the age of 18. I used to authorize them all the time because I couldn't find a reason not to authorize them.
I'm not a practitioner, so I think it's just I think that's going to be something that, you know, is going to be where the practitioners really need to push back a little bit. And I don't know, take your sovereignty back instead of just focusing on, you know, what the DEA says you cannot do. I think that's the challenge.
Yeah, I mean, I do think a lot of what you're saying and stating, I mean, obviously it's very true, is that it's a negative outcome of how we conduct clinical trials now. Mm-hmm. And the practical reality is we're trying to work at pace and velocity so that we can get that drug out into the market. And the clinical trials themselves are really ill-defined, right? We're not collecting the right evidence and data to say that we're developing something that can treat this and it's not treating here. We're just generalizing. So I'm a firm believer in things like technology, machine learning, and AI, because it's really about being able to collect vast amounts of data and make predictive outcomes so that we can do actual targeted, real prescription versus just generalizing and pushing something out there in the population.
Agreed.
Well, this is kind of a follow-up to the gentleman's question dealing with having enough quality participants in terms of both racial and cultural diversity. Mm-hmm. And that's a huge challenge. And I was hoping to hear some creative measures here on incentives, approaches, because without that, the drug trials are going to be stifled. We won't be able to get full-body participation among our population. And our segmented groups that are participating, it limits the effectiveness of that drug by drug trials. So I challenge you, come up with some creative means to stimulate, incentivize, or increase that level of participation among minorities and cultural groups.
Yeah, 100% agree.
When you run into
Absolutely.
Incentivization, though, you do run into some moral ambiguity, right? Like, you want people to participate, you want people from diverse backgrounds, but if there is, you know, especially monetary incentives, you can draw the wrong crowd, I guess, you know, or you can run into areas in which people, you know, like economically disadvantaged people are going to be tested on more. And that's scary. I mean, that's definitely not where I think any of us want to see the clinical trial process go. The incentivization needs to be something, I don't know, more defined with a long-term goal. Like, you know, maybe your Medicare premiums are paid for the rest of your life or something like that, you know, versus what we naturally think of as incentivization, which is, you know,
direct payment for services or energy.
Right, because if you're just writing them a check saying, hey, will you participate in this trial? We will pay you for this. That raises all kinds of questions of why are the people participating in the trial? Are they doing it because they genuinely think that they're going to help with developing some new treatment, getting it out there and making sure it works, or are they just in it for the money? And also it raises the problem of the people saying, we will compensate you for involvement in this trial. Why are they doing it?
Yeah, I mean, incentives are always a great way to do things, but you know, when you talk about incentives, you're really talking about a developed country, because are you going to be able to go to a tribe in Africa or Latin America, a small city, and provide an incentive there that's going to get them to participate? Or maybe you give them an incentive and then all of a sudden one of their folks in the town die, right? Then what happens is a distrust. I think it's a tough problem, but what you're really speaking to at the end of the day is the need to have diversity in clinical trials.
Yep.
And how do you do that, right? Incentives is a way, but I don't know if incentives would necessarily work in underdeveloped countries, right? Maybe they would, right?
I'd just like to follow up on the Dennis's questions. Yeah, I mean, well, I'm here not to ask a question, but share an opinion. I mean, the incentivization, yeah, there's ethical quandaries to it, but that's the lesser of two evils, right? And I think, I guess what you're talking about is very important in terms of the clinical trials and diversity. I would challenge you to figure out how you can get the city and state to create positive incentives to get companies to collect data. And at the federal level, they can cause negative incentives because Congress controls NIH's budget. Right? The solution, I don't think, is going to come from scientists or biotechs. It comes from people who vote in politicians and vote them back in again.
Yeah. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Very true.
Yeah.
Any more questions?
All right, guys, round of applause for our experts here.